joining me on a quilting tale today. My name is Shaylin, and today's video is a follow-up to my Scrappy Trip Around the World video that I did earlier this year, which compared 3 different methods for doing a trip around the world quilt, particularly a scrappy one. And so I had shown the traditional piece-by-piece method and the strip tube sub-cutting method. I went through those ones more quickly, and then I did a full demonstration of how to use a grid panel where you have an adhesive on the grid and you put your squares on that panel, fuse them on, and build a design with those panels. And so that method ended up being a little bit faster than the strip tube piecing method, but I had several questions in the comments section on that video that I wanted to address and just follow up with a little more information that I would have liked to share in that video that I thought of afterwards. So before I show you an up close of the binding and backing and quilting, one of the questions that I didn't mention in that first video was the dimensions of this quilt. So before washing it, it's 64 by 80 inches all finished. So that would be the dimensions. And then a lot of people asked about how heavy it was with the grid inside or how thick it was. And I actually, before filming this and before putting the binding on, did some close-up shots of what it looks like. So I'll actually cut to that footage, and that way you can see how thick it is compared to another quilt that I also had done at the same time that doesn't have a grid in it, and I'll give you my thoughts on it in that footage.
Before I get the binding on this quilt, I had some questions about the thickness of the quilt with the grid in it, so I thought I would show you. I don't quite want to reveal this top one for comparison yet, not till I finish it, but here is the top with the grid batting and backing. You can see it is very thin. I did use 100% cotton batting on this one. It's just what I had left. I actually prefer the 80-20 cotton poly blend, which is what this quilt has because it's just slightly loftier. So here you can see the top and the batting and the backing with no grid. So this one is a little thicker, just a tad bit fluffier. This one is much flatter, which 100% cotton batting is a little flatter. It's more traditional. It gives it kind of a moderate drape on the bed, and it tends to be a little heavier than the cotton polyester blend. So this one I like because, like I said, it's a little loftier. It's not quite as heavy as the cotton. One thing I will point out is you can, running your fingers along it, you can feel the ridges where those seams were pressed. So it's not more noticeable than, say, if you had a bulkier seam. If you had a thicker seam in a quilt top like this one feels pretty smooth, but I can feel around and I can feel like right there, there's a bit of a notch there where there was more seam coming together. So you can feel the seams, not anything noticeable, you know, when it's covering you, it's not like you're gonna feel something that's really ribbed, but I will wash it and see if there's a difference in how it feels. But just wanted that full disclosure that you can feel that there are seams there. You can't really see them though. If you look here, you can kind of see the quilting. So for something that's as thin as this is, it's not terribly noticeable.
Another tip that I would share is to use a denim needle. That's what I used for this one anyway, and it worked really smoothly. It's just a little stronger, and since you have a grid and that combined with the quilt top, especially a larger one, is just going to make some bulkier seams and make the fabric a little heavier. So I think a denim needle is a good choice for doing a quilt top like this with a grid. Something else that I thought might be worthwhile to share is from a viewer who mentioned in the comments when there were a few people saying that they've tried the grid before. some had specifically mentioned the Ten Sisters grids, and then others had mentioned just using the grid, so I don't know if it was that one or another kind, but just having issues with the fabric adhering to the grid. And so I didn't have issues with this one, but a viewer had mentioned that if you have used fabric softener or starch on your fabric, that might interfere with the adhesive. And so I'm not sure. I just thought that would be worth putting out there. I didn't starch or pre-wash my fabric. I just used it right off the jelly roll. I actually didn't even wet it like I normally would. I just started subcutting the strips, and I figured if it shrinks, it'll all shrink proportionally. So usually I would wet the fabric, spray it down with water, sometimes Best Press, because fabric does shrink a bit. So now the backing I did spray, so we'll see after I wash it if that is a big deal. But I just used the fabric straight out of the jelly roll. I only ironed the pieces, you know, like where the fold was or something if there was a big crease. So that's not something I typically do. I usually do prep the fabric more. But since they're all getting cut up into small pieces, I thought I would just see what happened with this one. Another thing that came up was the cost being a reason why you might not want to try this grid. And I had mentioned that I had purchased at a quilt shop the grid for $9 per panel, and it took 11 grids to make this, so that can be kind of pricey. I did afterward look up on Ten Sisters website just to see what they were selling for directly from them, and they have different bundles. I believe it was in bundles of 6, 20, 50 grids at a time. And so the price went down a little more the more you got, and at least for the 2-inch finish, the one that I used, it breaks down to less than $5 a panel. And when I went to put it in the cart just to see shipping, it said $12 flat rate shipping. So even with the shipping added on, it was still under $5 a panel. If you do the 20 panels or the 50 panels, it's even cheaper. I think even the lower ones, it still ended up being less than $5 a panel. So if that price is a little more comfortable, again, I just wanted to throw it out there. I'm not affiliated with Ten Sisters. It's just the grid that I used. I took a class this summer and I like it, and so I just wanted to share it. But it makes no difference to me if you get it elsewhere, or, you know, try a grid elsewhere, or don't try a grid at all. I just wanted to share, you know, my experience with it. So I'll also say, because this might seem like a more complicated way if you watch the video, maybe seem like some spatial gymnastics you might have to do to figure out how to build the blocks on a panel. And if that doesn't seem like it's for you, but you're still wanting to try a grid and see what that's like, they do sell books and patterns that have pre-drawn grids, and what color goes where, shows you how to build it like a puzzle, so you don't have to do the figuring out of where everything goes. It shows you what each panel should look like. I actually picked up one of the books when I took the class. This one is just called 10 Quilts for 10 Sisters, and they had a few different books there, but there are several quilts in here, and really beautiful quilts in here. And so again, it just shows you how to do each panel and the order to put them in. They also have individual patterns for sale on their site and a bunch of free ones on their site, so if you wanted to practice just doing a wall hanging with a single panel or just get comfortable with it, there were several like that. I actually took a class making a large spool on one panel, and that's how I learned to use the grid, and so I still need to get the binding on that, but it was just a great practice. And so they have a bunch that are free or 99 cents that you can try out. So it might be worth looking into if you're curious, but you don't want to, like I said, do the complicated layouts trying to figure it out. So again, just throwing it out there if that was something that was holding you back from trying it. Another viewer had mentioned that these grids seem like they'd be a good thing to use for pixelated art quilts, and if you look at those patterns, you'll see some that have that pixelated look. So I absolutely agree it would be great for something like that, not just a trip around the world quilt. But there are a lot of more traditional looking quilts in their books, but there are some more fun modern ones as well. So it might be worth checking out. Again, I'm not affiliated with them. I think there's some fun patterns there and just want to share it. So let's take a look now at the quilting on this, and I'll show you the binding and back, and then I'll pop it in the wash and let you know how it turned out and how it feels with the grid, if that makes a difference in the feel once it's been washed.
I chose a minty green thread, so it almost reads as white, and it blends in really well. I used a candy motif, so you can see there's some swirls and a lollipop with the ribbon, and then there's little candies, like the ones with the little wrappers on them. There's a lollipop above it. I'm trying not to get the shadow of the camera in the way, so hopefully this angle is picking up on it. There is a candy cane. And so it's just a scatter of candy. There's ribbon candy, there's gumdrops, and it really matches the fabrics that have a lot of sweets in them. So I thought this one would be perfect, and the density would be nice so it's not too tight. Do it at this angle, you might be able to see there's some gumdrops, the swirly lollipop with the bow around it. Up here you can kind of see the ribbon candy, more lollipops. So it's pretty subtle. You have to be up close to really see and appreciate the quilting. It blends in. I thought just because this one was busier with all the small squares, I'd keep it a thread that would blend in and not be too noticeable, but it's really cute. And then I did a striped binding, this one along with the fabric line, so just green, red, and white to frame it really nicely. And on the back I went with a gingham that Jessica Dayon had shared on her blog post when she made this quilt. So really cozy. Again, I sprayed this with water before I ironed it, so I'm hoping it doesn't have more shrinkage on the top. But let's get this in the wash now, and I'll be back in a little bit to show you the results when it's washed.
My quilt is out of the dryer and it turned out great. It looks wonderful. The color catchers were clean. If you want to see a video where I talk about how I launder my quilts, I'll put a link to that. But it looks really good. I spread it out to measure it, and there was just a little bit of shrinkage. It ended up being 62 by 77 inches, so it lost 2 inches going across and 3 inches down, which I usually do have a little bit of shrinkage even when I spray my fabrics and wash them, but nothing dramatic. The back still looks great. It seemed to shrink at a nice rate too. It doesn't look distorted or anything. And as far as the weight, I was trying to find another quilt this size, and I have a bunch of throw size quilts that are smaller, and I have larger queen size quilts that are on the bed, and so I don't have one really that's this size. This one is kind of in between. It would probably be like a full size bed quilt, I'm thinking. But I will say it does feel heavier than I would expect picking it up. I picked up a throw size quilt that's a little smaller than this one, and it definitely felt heavier. So that's something to consider. Some people like the extra weight. It doesn't feel massively heavier or anything, but it does, when you pick it up, it does feel maybe heavier than you'd expect for a quilt this size. And then as far as how it feels, I mean, it's soft just like the other quilts when I wash them. I can still feel those little ridges where the seams are, and then the parts where there aren't seams, it's just soft. It does feel a little thicker, but it drapes well and it looks really nice. There's you know, the standard crinkling that you get when you wash a quilt, but the points are all still intact, and I was measuring the squares, and you know, most of them shrank about a 1/16, somewhere between an 1/8 to a 1/16 of an inch, it seemed like. But no, I think it just looks great, so I'm really happy with it. And like I said, it's a little bit heavier in the winter time. I actually appreciate heavier quilts, so this will be nice come Christmas time. But I hope that answers your questions, those of you that had them or were wondering about things. If I missed something, please let me know. If you still have questions about what it was like to use a grid. And thank you so much for watching the first video and leaving comments and questions in there. I appreciate hearing from everyone and their preferences. And really, that's what it all boils down to, are preferences and what part of the process you like. You know, some methods take more time, but you might enjoy the cutting and individual piecing, and some people might value just the efficiency and getting through it quicker so you can move on to the next project. So really, you just find the method that works for you and that brings you enjoyment in your quilting process. So thank you so much for watching this quilt come together, and I have a bunch of fun quilts in store that I'll be sharing later on, some new ones, and then I'm wrapping up my Sparrows quilt, so stay tuned for those. Like and subscribe so you don't miss those, and I will see you next time.